And we're good to go, Jared.
All right, had to find my unmute button. Well, welcome. Thank you so much for being here for this webinar, Developing Community Partnerships. My name is Jared Hawkins. I'm joined by Lendel, Narine, Lisa Schainker, Sheriden, Hansen, and Elizabeth Cohen. We are all faculty at Utah State University Extension. And so it's very snowy out here in Utah. Hopefully it's not that snowy where you're coming from, but happy to share this space with you. Thanks for being here. To start out, I wanted to ask the question, what are the biggest issues in your communities? And go ahead and just throw a bunch of them in the chat. What do you think are the biggest problems in your area? Yeah, I'm seeing urbanization, loss of farmland, housing, childcare, water, mental health, low wages, affordable housing, clean water. Yeah, thank you so much for putting all these in. So many, I mean, there's so many big issues, right? What stands out to me about all of these issues is that they are what I would call wicked problems. They're problems that are so complex and they're interconnected, and this makes them very difficult to solve. One of the ways we can approach wicked problems that are, again, complex and interconnected, is through working together and including stakeholders and working across disciplines. When we're working by ourselves, I think we're often just treating symptoms. But when we work together, I think we can get to the root factors behind a lot of these really difficult issues. So to that end, today we're going to talk about how to develop and maintain and leverage community partnerships so we can better move the needle on these difficult issues in the area. Our panel will address 4 key topics. The first is, how can we collaborate to assess community needs? Second, how can we participate and help our coalitions, and how can we receive their support as well? How we can better work with elected officials. And then lastly, how can we leverage these partnerships to host successful events? Our panel comes from all over Utah, urban and rural areas, and also very different departments. And so we have a wide breadth of experiences to share with you today. And with that, we'll jump into our first point about collaborating to assess community needs.
Thanks, Jared. And thank you all for being here. I know this is a topic that's important, especially to early career faculty. One of the first things I do when I meet with our new faculty is talk about needs assessment. And it's more than just understanding the process, but understanding how do you work with others to get it done? Because a lot of the times you can find existing needs using secondary data, but understanding needs is only one part of a needs assessment. It's a much more involved process than that. So as the evaluation specialist at USU Extension, I work with our faculty to start off that process of collaborating in their counties. And always we start with the most basic definition of a needs assessment. It's a set of priorities undertaken to set priorities, make decisions, and allocate resources. When you start off, a lot of the people who start an extension now, because we have such a high turnover rate, our new faculty usually have a very limited background in extension. And that means that sometimes you start and you don't know what comes next or what should I do first. So I always recommend starting off with just understanding that needs assessment process. So I'm going to go through overview of what it is and how can you conduct one in the most collaborative way. So a needs assessment basically looks at 4 major issues. Looks at persistent needs. What are those things that are happening over and over and over? What are those underlying issues that we just can't seem to solve with one program or even a series of programming? Those persistent needs relate to things like affordable housing, things like low-income communities access to fresh produce. All those things are persistent. Another part of a needs assessment is understanding emerging needs. A lot of the times, extension responds to persistent needs, but then at the same time, persistent needs and emerging are interconnected. So having persistent needs occur over a long period of time may lead to other things that we just can't predict right now. So a needs assessment, when you're starting to figure out that process, a big part of it is trying to focus on those things that may happen as a result of existing needs. So it's looking one step ahead so that our programming becomes more proactive. And now we're looking at change in populations. When you conduct a needs assessment, especially when you're working with others, we have to consider the fact that our audiences, extension audiences, are always changing. And I think we can look at secondary data for demographics, but that doesn't give us the full picture of the issues faced in certain populations. So understanding that we need to account for those changing audiences is a big part of this needs assessment process. And also, part of the first initial stages is what are stakeholders' priorities, because we as Extension partner with stakeholders all the time. That includes county commissioners, organizations in the community, nonprofits, all these things who are already doing certain work that we may not want to replicate, but we can partner with others. So it's understanding their priorities in association with others. In this model, this is one way of getting our new faculty to think about the bigger picture and to think about how do we approach our responsibility to meet community needs by just like I'm looking at all those things that are happening and just trying to grasp the overall situation. So in the next slide, this is just an overview of how I approach a needs assessment because it breaks it up into something more than a survey. So I work with faculty, and because I'm a quantitative researcher, we automatically assume that we're going to do a survey. And that is definitely not the case with a needs assessment. It's much more involved than that, and it requires a lot of background work, and it includes survey if appropriate, but it also includes thinking about next steps. So in the first phase of a needs assessment is understanding secondary data, what already exists, what is already known, identifying those wicked problems as Jared described, and then identifying existing data sources. So this entire pre-assessment includes working with others to understand what already exists and what we already know about those needs. In the second phase, this is where you have the option to collect new data, to collect primary data. And you can do that through surveys, you can do that through focus groups, interviews, all these different things that generate new data that's current and relevant to your context. And this is also includes the analysis, the setting initial priorities, not absolute priorities, but initial, because you're going to be doing that in the next step. And then those causal analysis to understand emerging needs, where you connect things. How does one issue affect another? How does this persistent need connect to emerging needs? And then the last phase of needs assessment is really that involved collaborative process where you work with your team of extension agents in your county, where you work with stakeholders to set priorities. Because even if you do, let's say you do a survey, and these are the top 10 needs, that doesn't mean that these are the absolute needs. You can work with people in your county to understand what should we tackle first? Your needs assessment just guides that decision, and then you work together to identify solutions and then create program plans. In the next slide, we can show how this entire process is collaborative. So in most cases, when I work with our faculty in the pre-assessment, I always ask them to speak to stakeholders. You start an extension position and you have no background in extension. Chances are you're in a county building with county commissioners who are having frequent meetings. That's your opportunity to meet with them and talk about these things and start collecting that pre-assessment data, start making your field notes, conducting very brief interviews just to get an idea of what is going on, and then looking at secondary data. So if you spend some time just doing that, it gives you a better idea of what exists, what is already being done, what people are worried about, what are those things that that are the highest priority for the county. Now, that doesn't mean county priority is extension priority, because we have our programming plan. So that gives you the pre-assessment where you start to work with people and start to get to know names, start to make those connections. Then you take that data and go to the pre-assessment, is where you're going to start collecting your own data. And again, you can do that through surveys if you're going the quantitative route, and you can do that through focus group, which means that you can actually work with community members if you're conducting a focus group to understand what do they think are the needs. And these things can be one or the other or both, like a mixed methods approach. In the post-assessment is where you're looking at the results of that assessment. You're looking at what showed up as priorities, what are those high priority items, and how does that influence what you do. This is where you begin to have conversations with stakeholders in your county, have conversations with extension administration to understand how can you create programs that address these needs. And at the end of it, needs assessment would always be the first step of program planning. It gives you the framework you need to understand what are the activities, what are the interventions, what are the activities, who are my target audience if you're looking at changing populations, and how do I work with existing organizations, how do I partner with people, how do I collaborate to implement this program. And this collaborative process ensures that you have relevant programs, not repetitive programs, and that it has meaning to whoever it is you're trying to reach, that target audience, so that you have impact later on. So that's the idea of conducting a collaborative needs assessment, working with others through the 3 phases of this process. So, Jared?
Yeah, thank you, Lendel. All right, now we'll go to Lisa to talk about working with coalitions.
All right. Well, it's morning here in Utah, so good morning or good afternoon from wherever you are right now. So I'm going to share my experience working with coalitions and work groups. This has been a really strategic approach that I've had since I started my position in a new state, in a new community where I'd never worked or lived. And so for me, this was how I've really established my new programming area. And so I wanted to share my experience with you. And Jared, I guess you're going to need to, yeah, thank you. Okay, so obviously the first step here is identifying the existing coalitions. They're not always coalitions, sometimes they're issue-specific initiatives, they might be work groups, but they're whatever existing entities exist, especially where their work aligns with what you want to be doing in your community that you serve. And then, obviously, again, we're going to consider whether your involvement in this initiative or coalition work group can help your constituents. Can I have a meaningful impact if I get involved in this? So one of the important things these are sort of guidelines that have helped me is whether the type of involvement that makes sense in each of these. So for example, in some cases, they might say, hey, we need someone to lead this subgroup of this coalition. And as an extension professional, I might say, well, that seems like a great opportunity for me. If it's like professional development and training, I might say, yeah, that's exactly aligns with what I should be doing. So that's a great opportunity for me to do that kind of work. If it's something that I don't have as much experience in, or I don't really feel like it's a good use of my time, then that's not something that I want to take on. So another example is some of the coalitions are like, we're looking for people that want to manage budgets. And I'm like, oh, that's not really in my wheelhouse or something that I really want to be involved in. So really trying to figure out what is the best way to be involved in these work groups or coalitions, and trying to figure out what's going to help you the most as in your work, and what's going to maybe potentially create more challenges for you. In terms of, for most of us, it's about taking up our time. Let's be real about it. We can easily say yes to everything if we allow ourselves. So we really do have to set those boundaries. Okay, next. All right, so in terms of the benefits of coalition involvement, and I'm sure most of you already know this, but you get an existing network of partners and their connections, and that has opened an extremely helpful number of doors for me. In addition to that, our local champions, and the champions really are those individuals who are in those communities. Maybe they work with specific populations that you're interested in. For me, and serve as those gatekeepers. So for me, I'm specifically interested in working with our Hispanic populations here in Salt Lake County. And so finding those individuals who have access to, that are part of that community and have easy access to those populations has served me really well. If I go and start trying to talk to them and say, hey, come to my parenting class, they're going to be like, I don't know who you are. I don't know. I don't trust you. If somebody that they know comes in and says, hey, this person is trustworthy, they have good things to offer our community, that really helps to open doors. So through the coalition, through the two coalitions that I've been involved with, I've been able to find those individuals who could serve as gatekeepers to me to those populations, which has been amazing. Another thing that I've found is having access to resources, both in kind and financial. So this might be having, as an example, in our case with classes that we do for parents, it's having people that are able to do childcare for us, or to be on site to help with arranging the classes, helping with food, all those kinds of things. So having access to that, we worked with a youth group that was part of our coalition. They were able to come in and do the childcare for us. So having that access to the resources, and then financial resources. I'm going to tell you my sort of success story at the end, but financial resources can be a really valuable part of being involved in coalitions as well. All right, so in terms of opportunities to support the coalition, one of the things that I had to do when I first started was, because I was an unknown entity, it was letting them know what I can do. Who are you? What do you do? Well, my background's in prevention, substance misuse prevention specifically. So for me, it was like I needed to find those prevention coalitions, and then they needed to understand what I could bring to the table to help them. So I through doing some different trainings, through having conversations, through sharing my ideas, I was able to really show that, oh, she knows what she's talking about. So we're going to give her opportunities to do trainings for us on prevention, or on team development, or coalition building. So all those kinds of things. So I was able to demonstrate my value to the coalition, and then they come back and ask for more from me, which is really helpful. Providing trainings or direct support. So, oops, not quite, Jared. So being able to, some of the things that I've done, I guess I mentioned a lot of those, but what are your areas? These are things that, basically a lot of extension professionals have access to, or have that knowledge. So whatever that is, if it's team development, sustainability, grant writing, community engagement, needs assessment, evaluation. So any of those things, these coalitions need help with. So when you're able to bring that to them, it's extremely valuable. And I just noticed someone put a comment in the chat about gatekeepers and offer additional detail. So I think what, okay, and you know what, Dan, that might be a good like offline conversation as far as specific gatekeepers in the Hispanic population. So maybe we can have that conversation.
Thanks.
All right, so, or do you want to, or can, I don't know how this works. Can we?
I'll put my
Maybe-
email address in there and then maybe you reach me. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. Okay. All right. So, and then just my last slide that I wanted to share. Go ahead, Jared. Thank you. Is, and go ahead. So basically, once my coalition members were able to see kind of what I was able to do, I wanted to bring in a new parenting program to the community. I wanted to reach those Spanish-speaking families. The members of the coalition were like, we want to write a grant to support you. So my coalition actually wrote a grant on my behalf, and they got money from the health department for me to start up these parenting classes, and it's been amazing. And in addition to that, I basically just felt kind of surrounded by support to kind of get this off and running, and not the whole coalition, but specific key partners. And they were like, we really, the ones that were invested in helping this specific population. And so I have a picture here of one of our graduation groups, and it was just, and so this continues to be super successful, and I contribute a lot of the success to working with my coalitions. So that's all I have.
Okay, so it's my turn. Working with elected officials, we sometimes don't think of them so much as stakeholders, but they really are stakeholders in our community, especially if you're working with county commissioners, city council, and they can hold funding for extension, and they can sometimes make or break us with that funding source. So working with them is a really key portion of this whole idea of, you know, building these programs and being able to work within your communities. And you can't work with them if you don't know who they are. So I've got a QR code. You can either scan it or you can go to this MyReps website. You can enter in your zip code and it will tell you like who your local officials are if they're listed. Sometimes they're not listed because of elections and changes. So sometimes you have to do a little more digging, but it will also give you your state officials as well as your national officials as well. So you know, a really key piece is just starting to get to know them and know who they are, know a little bit of background about them, what their key interests are, because it may be something that relates back to your programming and things that you're doing. So you want to establish and maintain relationships with these people, especially at the county or city levels where you're at. It's quite easy to get to know these people and to start to build those relationships. Ask them what their community focus is, what are their interests, and do those play into your program? What are the needs that they're seeing in the community? And how can you address them? One way to get to know them a little bit better is they often have a website that's listed on that MyReps website or through social media or anything like that. But you can go to their websites and you can, there's usually a personal statement that talks about their key interests, their platform, and there will also be links to their social media accounts. Now, you don't have to like your official to like your official on social media, okay? And following them can give you some really key insight as to what those issues are at the moment in your community, what they're concerned about, and what they're focusing on at that moment. Jared, if you can go forward for me. Thank you. So when you approach your elected officials and you're trying to talk to them, you're trying to get funding, or you're trying to get, you know, some kind of key factor from them that will help with your programming or a problem in your community, there's a really good way to tell your story to an official. I attended PILD last year. If you're not familiar with PILD, it's the Public Issues Leadership and Development kind of, yeah, it's a great big conference, and it's held in Washington, D.C. every year, and it's great. And they had a key speaker that came in last year, and he talked about telling your story. And it was impressive. He had this really great example where a dad stood up to give his daughter a toast at her wedding. And he stood up to do the toast, and he brought out graphs and growth charts and, you know, all this irrelevant information that was all data driven, that when you're expecting a toast from somebody, especially the father of the bride, you want emotion and you want to feel how he's feeling at the moment. So sometimes We need some emotion put into this. It's great to have data. It's awesome to have that. But sometimes that story needs to be backed up with some emotion, a real life story, something that they can connect to, because sometimes they don't connect to the numbers the way we do in extension. We're kind of numbers driven, and they may not be. So having that real story is important. Things to think about when you're preparing to talk to somebody. Remember to be succinct. We don't want to give, this big flowery story that takes 10 minutes when we could have done it in 2 or 3 and gotten right to the point. Remember, their time is sometimes limited. Avoid jargon. Coming from a university world, and I used to be a nurse too, now I'm a horticulturist, but we have, shortened versions of all these different words. We use acronyms. People don't know what we're talking about sometimes. So make sure that you use layman terms and not jargon. Stick to the facts. Don't embellish, because they will fact check us. They will come back and say this wasn't 100% accurate. So make sure you really do stick to those facts. And be enthusiastic and confident about the story that you're telling and about the need that you're trying to address and the ask that you are sending to them. You are the expert here. Sometimes we get intimidated when we go to talk to these people, and there is no reason to be intimidated. You know more about this subject matter than they really ever will. So they look to us as the expert when we come to them with a problem, or when they come to us to ask for help with a specific problem that we might be able to address the need for. Jared, if you could go forward. Thank you. Again, when you're telling your story, stick to those highlights, keep it brief. And then we talked a little bit about that emotion. Now that emotion should move them, but it shouldn't overwhelm them. I shouldn't leave a senator crying in the middle of the Capitol building, right? So I want to give them just enough emotion so that they feel like they have an emotional connection with this story. Motivate them with hope and a solution. Don't just drop a problem in their lap. Tell them what you want to do about it. Make sure that you give them a solution and that you're part of that solution. How can we solve this? And make sure you make that ask, because what's the point of bringing the story if we're not going to ask them to help us? We need space to do this. We need funding for this. We need support for this program. And that gives them, you're giving them that call of action. Now the ball is in their park. What are they going to do to help address this issue that is key in their community? Go ahead, Jared. Okay, so also I would remind you to take time to listen to them. So I've given you a lot of information about telling your story, but sometimes it's good to just sit and listen. So if you have time with a county commissioner or with a city council person and they start to talk to you, ask them, to share some of those concerns and those key issues, and then really turn on your listening skills, because it may be key for developing a program or approaching a problem that maybe you didn't know was there, or that will be very impactful in your community. I was approached by a state legislator that was up. He wasn't even in my county. He's in Wasatch County, which is much closer to where Elizabeth is. And I was asked to work on a bill for Utah's House Bill 390. And it's an urban farming initiative. And the reason I was approached is because I'm in a county where we have a massive loss of farmland, and our main crop is growing houses. So we are losing our farmland and putting in residential buildings. And so I've been dealing with this problem with urbanization for a while, but where he's located, it's starting to be a much bigger problem. It's starting to look more like my county. And so he came to me and asked me for some very key specific yield data on what you would expect to grow on an acre of an urban farm, in our climate, in our environment, all of these different things. This was a very complex problem because Utah is really quite variable as far as climate, soil, temperature. So I pulled in some specialists. I pulled in our vegetable specialists, our fruit specialists, and our cut flower urban farm specialists. And we started to work through the data that he needed from us. How much would we expect to grow on an acre of property? And so we came up with some numbers, and then we came up with a sliding scale that you could adjust for Utah based on where you are and based on the skill level of the farmer and all of these different things. And this played into this House Bill 390 that essentially made Greenbelt for small acreages available. So tax breaks to help us maintain farms in key places where farming may be lost due to urbanization. So that's one great story that came from him coming to me and giving me a need, and me actually listening and saying, how can we address this? And how can we work through the problems that we see in Utah? I was also addressed this last legislative session about a beekeeping bill that would take out removable frames from our hives. And if you know anything about beekeeping, maybe you do, maybe you don't. If we can't take out those frames, we can't do a hive inspection, we can't treat for certain diseases, and we can't test for certain diseases. So I was asked to give a testimony in the legislative session regarding why this was or was not a good idea. And from my standpoint, it was not a good idea. And so working with some other beekeeping entities with our local Utah Department of Ag and Food, I was able to provide a testimony that aligned with our regulations in Utah, and with, with also the belief that this was not the best idea. And we were able to stop the bill at that moment and make this so that it was conducive for having healthy hives in Utah. So listening to those needs again, we were able to make an impact. I will caution you when working with government officials that you always need to follow your university regulations. So Utah State University, we have a legislative liaison. When I worked with, for the House Bill 390, that legislative liaison was with me every time I met with that legislator, just so that they knew what was said and everybody was on the same page. When I did the testimony for the beekeeping legislation, that legislative liaison again was notified. I told him of my intent, everything that I was going to say, and made sure it was okay with my university for me to move forward with this plan. So your university may be different, and you just have to work with them based on what their expectation is. But, as far as it goes with most local representatives, if you're dealing with a county commissioner, you don't necessarily need a legislative liaison. You are addressing needs and listening to what they also can communicate to you as a concern. So usually there's not a problem with the local government. Go ahead, Jared. I think that's it for me. All right, that's it for me. But if you have questions on dealing with government officials, I'd be happy to answer them.
Hi, I am Elizabeth, and I'm going to talk about leveraging partnerships to host successful events. And I started with Utah State University Extension in January of 2020. And so I just had a couple of months before things got real COVID-y. And so it was really challenging to meet those gatekeepers that Lisa was talking about, because we couldn't go to in-person meetings. So my first piece of advice is to just show up even if you feel like the meetings are not necessarily directly applicable to your programs. If you go to them consistently, those stakeholders in those community groups, like for me, conservation districts were really important in building relationships with the ranchers in our county. So because I am not a rancher, and even though I've lived in this county for a while, I am not in that community. And so showing up to conservation district meetings consistently for a long time really helped me build those relationships with key ranchers that are now their gatekeepers to that community. And so now if I invite them to a program or tell them I'm having a program, they can get the word, help me get the word out better than I could do on my own. But it was challenging to build those relationships. And I really just had to say yes to lunches, site visits. If somebody called me and asked me for help and I didn't have the answer or the resource, I would help them find that resource in the community. Also paying attention to their interests, their needs, their values, and just looking for a way to be helpful really helped improve those relationships. And with the conservation district specifically, when I first started, I I don't know how familiar you are with stream restoration, but we have these fake beaver dams. They're called beaver dam analogs. And when I first started, the ranchers in the conservation district kind of thought that they were fringe environmental conservation techniques, and they were not very interested in it. And just by consistently showing up and working on building those relationships, the local watershed coordinator and I were able to get them to pay $10,000 and host a big outdoor workshop so that local ranchers could see beaver dam analogs in action. So just showing up and being helpful really turned around those relationships and helped us be able to host a really good event. Can you go forward, Jared? Also, taking advantage of the social networks of your partners is really important. When I moved into my position, I didn't have a huge email contact list, especially for ranchers. I didn't have an up-to-date mailing list. So it was really hard to invite people to programs because I didn't have their contact information. So I could do social media and I could do word of mouth, and I can, put a flyer at the feed store, but I didn't have those big contact lists. And so by building relationships with the local weed department, I was able to get a list of people who had bought herbicide in our county so that I could invite them to relevant programming that I was hosting. Also, the conservation districts were able to share their email and mailing address list with me, which really helped us build our contact list, which we really didn't have before. And also, one of the things about learning about your community stakeholders, you have to kind of pay attention to how they take in information. We have a lot of older ranchers. They are not going to sign up on Eventbrite, and they are not going to check their email. So a flyer or a word of mouth or an actual postcard in the mail will really make a big impact. And that's not something that I would necessarily think about because I check my email a lot more than I check my real mail. So it's just a different approach. Can you go ahead, Jared? And the other thing is to partner with people you actually like. You don't have to do that, but it just makes everything easier and more fun. This is a picture of the watershed coordinator and her employee that we hosted the Beaver Dam Analog event together. And it was like 8 months of planning, and we had a lot of meetings. And so genuinely liking the people that you partner with is really helpful because then when you have to have a bunch of meetings to plan things, at least it's enjoyable. You can keep going. But one of the things that was really helpful, especially with that particular project, because it was logistically very complicated, was to clearly define the partnership in writing. Email is fine. It didn't have to be like a contract, just to divide the tasks. And that ensures that the tasks are divided evenly, or if they are divided unevenly, that everyone is aware that things are uneven and they are aware of their role. And one of the other things that's important is to always be honest about your capacity, because we get invited to do so many different things, and a lot of them are really cool and you would want to participate in them, but you just have to look at your capacity and also communicate if that capacity changes. I recently had to step off of a watershed coalition board because I just don't have the capacity to be a good board member right now. So just being honest and communicating with your partners is really important. For this particular BDA event, it was kind of like planning a wedding. We had to, the site was out of cell phone range, kind of far away from town. We had to coordinate catering, tents, porta potties, parking. There were just a lot of moving parts. And so really organizing and dividing those tasks helped us keep things on track, and it's so that one person wasn't in charge of everything. And having an awareness of what's on your partner's to-do list is helpful too, because if they aren't available, you can kind of step in for them. So can you go to the next slide? And the last thing is to serve good food. I know this sounds really kind of silly, but I, on multiple events, have gotten comments that somebody only came for the food and they ended up learning something or enjoying the program, but they weren't like expecting a whole lot out of the program when they signed up for it. They just wanted to come for free lunch. And recently I hosted 2 workshops for beef producers. And for the first one, I tried to serve really good food. And I told people that I was going to serve really good food. And so we had about 55 people show up on a weeknight. And here, I don't know how it is where you are, but we're starting to do a lot of calving. And so to get the producers to come, had to entice them a little bit. And also for this BDA event, it was in the summer, which is the worst time to try to get ranchers to go anywhere because they're all moving irrigation lines and working really hard. But we got 85 people to come to the middle of nowhere to look at beaver dam analogs. And a lot of that was because we served good food. We used the Conservation District mailing lists. We invited people in a variety of different ways. And we had really strong partnership relationships that helped us work together to be able to host a really good event.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And yeah, thank you for all of these ideas. It is pretty remarkable how we can better assess needs when we're working together. We can, Lisa shared that her coalition, wrote a grant for her, and Sheriden talked about how she was invited to work on a bill. Elizabeth talked about being able to host these really successful events. So it is quite remarkable what we can do together when we partner and when we partner well. So thanks again for tuning in. And just to close, I really do believe that when you think about the problems in your area, whatever those big issues are, I really believe that when you work together with your partners, you can not only address the symptoms of those, but you can make long-term sustainable change with these partnerships. So thanks, and we will gladly take some questions if you have questions.
Okay, so while people are thinking, I have one question, and if there are others, we can jump in as well. So I know, Lisa, the comment was a little about sort of gatekeepers, but maybe specifically Hispanic. But I guess thinking on a broader scale, we all have maybe have experienced gatekeeper somewhere along our line. So I thought maybe somebody might have a good story about how maybe you tackled that gatekeeper from the group that you felt was successful at the end, like I dare say tactic, because that sounds sort of very strategic, but tactic for how you might have gotten around a gatekeeper that you experienced in any of the sort of ways that you guys talked about today.
Well, I can go back to kind of sharing a little bit about my experience. So I also started like right before COVID, and so I really had to do this meeting people virtually, and I did a lot of kind of snowball meeting people virtually. So I would meet with somebody, and then it would be oh, maybe you need to talk to so-and-so. And so I did a lot of that. And I would ask for warm handoffs from people that somebody else knew. So I did a lot of that kind of work. So it wasn't me doing a cold outreach to anybody. It was always like, can you introduce me to so-and-so? And when it came from somebody that they knew and trusted, that really worked out well. And it kind of started for me with a person that was another faculty member who was in my office who had been here for some time. And he actually introduced me to a number of people. He just said, hey, I'm going to put out to my network that you're going to present about a project that you're interested in working on. And then basically it was like whoever got to come, and then and from there I just kind of started my journey of like meeting person after person and making connection after connection that way. And basically as I got involved in the coalitions, then I found, you know, one of my really big helps with the Hispanic population was the United Way. There was a person they were doing more of a grassroots effort in some specific communities where I was interested in working. And so just that they were actually having parent groups, and they were like, can you come and talk to the parents directly? Well, I don't speak Spanish, so it's really tricky. But the fact that I showed up, that I was there, that I was trying to make that connection and outreach directly to those parents went a long way. And they were like, I was like, hey, I don't have enough people to sign up for my class. And then they were all like, we'll come. And so basically that happened, and it just made me feel so wonderful that I had done that outreach. I'd put in the work. And then just kind of, like I said, one person at a time, meeting the right people that connected me right to the groups. And from there, once you have that word of mouth, it really can grow and build from there. So that was kind of my approach. Warm handoffs from people that people know. So you never know until you ask who they know and who they're connected with. So it was a lot of that for me.
I had a similar experience with the ranchers because they are very skeptical about accepting new people. And so I just had to be really nice and really helpful to like the two main ranchers that came to meetings that I went to. And once they liked me, then they would help invite other people to my programs and help me. But I had to just be really nice and really helpful for like a year to build that relationship.
Thank you. Other questions from attendees? Okay, well, thank you, Jared and team. I would just remind you to look for upcoming announcements if you haven't already. We have a ESP webinar every month. So April 26th is our next one. The topic, graphic organizers, tools you need for great extension programming. Casey Bozeman out of Georgia will be our presenter. Other than that, just a reminder, I will early next week, you'll receive the recording and the PowerPoint as well from the team for your reference if you want to go back and watch it. Other than that, again, thanks Jared and team from Utah State on a great presentation. We appreciate it.